Alright, now let's get started with the project. So this is something that I would always recommend. You create yourself kind of like a fake project like this, so that it forces you to go through a bunch of different steps that kind of mimic the real life scenarios. And well, if you don't know what that looks like, I'm going to give you an example right now. So what this is going to be about is, let's say you have somebody on your team that is developing, like a designer that's developing new races for a new massive multiplayer online game, something like that. And they have a bunch of races already, and they want this new races. So in this case, this is going to be heavily inspired by this particular image. Oftentimes it's not going to be much. There's not going to be anything at all. Sometimes, maybe just like the designer in question maybe did a couple of Google searches and found a bunch of images that he kind of liked, that he would want you to get inspired by. In this case, we have this painting that was done before, so that would be kind of like an example. And then it would be coming to you, and it would kind of explain, very briefly what the task is. And in this case, it would be to develop this new race, which is like a flower kind of creatures that are born in those flowers. So it's a big game. That's one of the races. They're supposed to be pretty. They're supposed to be small, and he's basically asking you to come up with what that race would be. So now that you know that, there's a couple of things that you can do. If you imagine a multiplayer online game, you would have, or like an RPG kind of game, you would have different customization options most of the time. So that's what we'll be focusing on here. So we're gonna have a bunch of different versions of that race, a bunch of different types of creatures, not types of creatures, but variations on the body, variations on the hair, the facial features, that kind of stuff. So just to give them as good an idea as possible of what that new race could be. And then if they really like it, it's something that they can scale up as much as possible. So let's say you present, in this case we're going to be doing 3 different variations, and what they could do after that is just scale it up to maybe 10, 20, whatever. So in the game maybe you'll have 20 different options for faces, 20 different options for bodies, whatever. The goal when you're in a pre-prod, which is kind of what we're doing here, or like a proof of concept phase, is to basically show them what it could potentially be, so without having to put the work to create all those different variations. So here we go. This is so we know the brief now, and it's pretty straightforward. So at this point, I just want to create a few different characters, a few different bodies, in in different poses, just to give kind of like an idea of how they behave, how they pose, their idle poses, just to get a feel for what that new race would be. So in this case, I'm gonna start. If we talk a little bit more about technical aspect here, very simple still in Photoshop. So it's going to be, I'm going to just draw very rough naked bodies on the background layer using whatever brush you want. It's not nothing's really that important at this point. I just want to get a couple bodies down. In this case I'm drawing them, but you could easily use reference. You could easily grab images from Google and just like modify them into whatever you're designing. So in this case, I'm gonna go with a fairly regular anatomy. So nothing. It's gonna be stylized a little bit, but not too crazy. So proportions-wise, it's going to be somewhat realistic, if only a little bit exaggerated. And for this race, it's going to be females only, so there's not going to be any males in that race. They're flowers, so they don't need to reproduce, that kind of stuff. So that's the logic. And female characters are more fun. So, but again, that would be part of the brief. In this case, as I said, I'm going to be making 3 different variations, and the reason for 3. You could do less or more than that. I find 3 gives a good 3 is easily scalable, so you can get a really good idea for like a, you know, the variety of characters that you could produce with that. So 3 is going to be a number that we use throughout this tutorial, pretty much for everything. So it's going to be 3 of each, 3 of each, 3 of each. So yeah, it's going to be three different bodies. I like to start with the naked bodies just to make sure that the anatomy is correct, you know, it's what I want, and then you dress them up. But in this case, since we're designing the races and we're not planning on designing any armor or clothes just yet, it's going to come a little bit later. But yeah, for now it's just, you know, we're just designing the race. We're not worried about what they're going to wear, what they're going to do. It's, you know, we have complete freedom at this point. We just want to create something cool, something that looks pretty, and something that the designers will like. So yeah, thinking about you know, flowers as kind of the source of inspiration for this. So you want them to be elegant, gracious, you know, everything but rough looking. So you want them to be like polished looking, fragile looking. So you can see here I am still on the background layer, and if you see a discrepancy between the what's being drawn and the actual cursor, is because while I was capturing the videos, I wasn't recording the cursor for some reason, so it's not there. So I had to speed up the video a little bit so that you can kind of guess where it is at all times, just based on you know, the brush strokes happening. But that's also interesting because it'll allow me to kind of point at other things while the drawing is being created on its own. Yeah, so here I'm pretty much done with the anatomy of the main, you know, the first character. I kind of like it. So it's you know, kind of muscular, feminine at the same time, which is an interesting look. And now I'm gonna go ahead and just work on the head. So the characters are gonna have the, you know, those little like stems thing on their head, part of their hair, and that's the theme that I'm gonna keep for all of them. So that, you know, just based on the original drawing. And that's another area where you can kind of play with it and have those be different for all the different characters. So while working on this, you know, if I was working in a studio, at this point, you know, I haven't spent that much time on it, but at this point already would be a good time to go show my colleagues, go show the leads, the art director, you know, if they like that kind of body. Just, you know, just a quick email, or just, you know, bring them over your desk, ask them, you know, is this something that you think is cool? And of course, that's while you're working. If you're not working yet, which you know, you probably aren't if you're watching this video, but do exactly the same thing. So since this is something that you would do at work, try to do the same thing at home. So of course you don't have any, you know, art director to just, you know, bring over to your desk, but you have the power of social media. So you can always, and you should always, upload your stuff, you know, as you're working on it, as it's a work in progress, and try to seek feedback on, you know, as many different platforms as you can. So you have resources like, you know, the QBrush forums, for example. They're really good for that. So there's sections where you can just post your work in progress to get feedback. You can do the same thing on Facebook. If you don't have that many followers on Facebook, you can always join, you know, art groups. There's a ton of them, and normally they're pretty good at helping people, helping artists. And yeah, or you should also start an Instagram, start a page on ArtStation, a portfolio on ArtStation, CG Society, DeviantArt, you know, all those places, because the more the better. The more feedback, the better. So now the first character is done. I wanted her to look very, very similar, if not almost identical to the one that I had previously painted. So that's going to be kind of like my based model, I guess, to work off of. So the other ones are going to be just variations on that. So as you can see, the lines are not perfect. It's still a little bit rough, but you get a really, really good idea of the anatomy and the overall kind of body shape that they have. And that's all that's needed so far. You don't want to push too much. You don't want to spend too much time polishing something. before you get approval. Same thing, you know, if you're working from home and you're posting this stuff on the internet, it's, you know, whenever you want to take a break, if you think you've worked on something for a little while and you think it's all right, but you know you're not 100% sure, before moving on to the next big step, post it online, ask for feedback, ask for, you know, what people think, and yeah, come back from your break, look at the feedback, and work off of that. That's going to be basically your entire career, so it's good to get started early. So again, for the second one here, I'm just slowly building the body, making sure that the anatomy works as much as possible, trying to keep the same proportions as the first one. So in this one, you know, it's all self-imposed, but there are a lot of guidelines that I'll be following, and it's you know, that's part of this whole exercise, to work with guidelines. So the guidelines are basically this race is going to be just one body type, or at least I'm going to be just designing one body type. So there's games where you could have like a fat version, a really skinny version, a muscular version, a more normal version. In this case, this particular race is going to be all the same body, you know, depending on the game you're working on. Also, it's just this scale, the scope can vary greatly. So in this particular case, what I'll be working with is same body type, the kind of customization that we'll be able to do with the characters in the game, not in the game because it's not going to exist, but in the fake game, if it were to exist, it would be, you can change the skin color, you can change the faces, you can change the hair, and that is it. So you'd be able to swap, you know, between those three different elements. And just by having, in this case, just by having 3 elements for each, you know, 3 different elements and 3 of each, you can get, you know, a bunch of variations already, which is pretty cool. So that's why I was saying that you get, you know, even if you don't do much, with 3 you get a really good example, you get a really good idea of what the game would be like if you were to scale that up, you know, and add 4th, 5th, 6th version. So as a concept artist, your job is to figure stuff out, right? So a lot of the times, a lot of the art that I see online, people tend to be lazy, and understandably, you know, that there are certain things that are just not fun. It's all part of the stuff that it's all part of the task of being a concept artist. Is you have to figure stuff out so that others don't have to. If a 3D artist has to look at your concept and has no idea what the hell's going on, has to figure out everything, that's not gonna work, and you'll get in trouble, or you just won't get the job. Just coming from a concept artist, things that are impressive is how well you can figure things out, and how detailed and how like thought out things are. When you know, recruiters see this kind of stuff, it's always a really good thing. So basically, you know, in this case, everything that you don't see, you want to draw it so that people can see it. So let's say, you know, the character had like a cape or something like that, and you're doing the front view. You can't see the cape from the front, so you would draw that, you know, somewhere else so that people can see it. If you have a weapon that's in a particular angle, a particular perspective, you'll want to draw it in another one so that, you know, you can clearly see what the actual thing looks like, so that there's no questions when it comes to time to make it in 3D. Yeah, so this particular step in the pipeline is a lot of fun. So that's the fun part, where you get to do whatever you want. You're just trying things out, right? So most likely none of that, but not much will remain at the end. So, you know, you're just drawing the first pass. So that's kind of how you have to, you know, approach the whole process. It's just a first version. You know, the final version may be version 10, right? So it'll change a lot along the way, and most of the time for the better. So even if you think your drawing is really cool, you know, with the input of everybody else, generally speaking, even though it might not seem like it at the beginning, at first, when you first hear the feedback, from my experience, it always ends up adding something better to the art. So feedback is super important, and revision is super important. So, you know, don't be afraid of those. Don't get attached to your drawing too much, because they'll be erased. They'll go away. So yeah, in this step of the process, as I said, we're kind of in a pre-production. And what a pre-production is, if you want to talk about that a little bit more in depth, pre-production is at the beginning of a project. So you have like a team working at a studio, or maybe like an indie developer has an idea, and it's mostly just an idea, something that could be really, really cool, and you don't have that many people on your team. Maybe you just assembled a team of a few artists to try to do something with that idea. So try to make something cool out of it. Ideas are easy to come, but execution is always the crucial part of it. So if you have a really good idea but the execution sucks, it's never going to go anywhere. So pre-production is kind of there to see if that's going to work. So you take an idea, something that everybody likes, and then you assemble a small team. If you're a AAA studio, that small team might not be that small, but it's still going to be like maybe a dozen people, right? So a few programmers, a few designers, a producer, game director, and then a few artists, a handful of artists. So for me, for example, when I started working at Blizzard, I was on a pre-production for Titan, the game Titan, which some of you probably know, ended up turning into Overwatch. So when I moved to California to join that team, I think I was the 30th employee, something like that, then the second artist on the team. So it was a very, very small team at that point, from a AAA studio perspective. But still, it was 30 people, right? So there was a lot of stuff happening already. That had been added for a couple months already. So I was joining while it was the idea seemed good enough that they could dedicate that much resources to it. But still, that was still a pretty small team. As if I look at the art team only, especially the art team, I mean, there was only two of us. So 2 of us and an art director. So that was super fun, because that's the pre-production is always where you don't know much. There's no rules. There's no deadlines really. There's no publisher at that point. It's just you're just trying to create something cool to eventually pitch it to a publisher, and then hopefully it gets funded. At least that's how most studios work. Of course, if you're Blizzard, you have your own publishers. So Activision is your own publisher. Blizzard is its own publisher. So they can kind of do whatever they want. But for the most cases, most studios will work on the game for a while and just trying to make it as cool as possible, and then look for a publisher, and then kind of finish the game with the money from the publisher. So that initial part, it's very important. It's your sales pitch. It's if it sucks, you're not going to get funded, and everything you've done is for nothing. But if it's good, you might hit the jackpot and get a really, really good publishing deal, and be able to finish your game and possibly make a fortune doing that. So it's super exciting, especially if you don't have any money invested in it, because then you can just do cool art. So as an artist, that was kind of what I joined when I joined at Blizzard, and that was what I had been doing at A2M as well. Prior to that, just a bunch of different pitches. So when I joined the team, what I was just doing is just it was exactly that. So you have the art director. It comes to you and it's like, okay, so we're thinking of doing this new thing. We don't know what it's going to look like, so go ahead and have fun. So that's that part of the production, always really, really fun. But that's a minority, right? The game's starting, still a minority in the entire industry. Same thing pretty much for movies. So if you're working in a movie production, artists will get brought in at the very beginning during the pre-prod to generate a bunch of ideas, and then most of them will go away. And then when the production is actually undergoing, they're gonna have only a few key artists that they keep to do the rest of the work. But film's a little bit different. Definitely more competitive, so a lot harder to get in. And if you get in, it's like contract. It's not as stable of a job, but they're both equally fun, especially during that time of the production, at the very beginning. Now, if I talk about during a production, because I've also experienced that for many years. So what a production is after pre-prod, after you're done with your pre-production, something, it's a game that's come together so well that the company or the publishers or whoever's funding this thing thinks that they can turn that into an actual game that will sell and that will make money. Then they move on to production, and then it's go time. So it's when you're at that step, it's a lot is on the line. So as compared to the pre-prod where you could afford to try things, when you're in production, normally things have been figured out. You know what you're gonna do. Kind of like you're gonna have this many races, you're gonna have this many armor sets, you're gonna have this many weapons, this many environments. When you go into production, the list of things to build. When you're in pre-prod, you don't know. So that's why, you just try things out, like what I'm doing right now. We're just building this race and, seeing if we can come up with something cool. But if we were in a production, in the real production, then you would know, okay, we have like 5 races that we need to build. And then you just go. So you build them. And then, the process is similar, but at least there's no, exactly how many you're going to need. So that's the big difference. Yeah, you might get a little bit less time to do them because you have a deadline. When you have a production, you have, depending on the production, maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, depending. It varies greatly depending on the kind of project and the kind of team you are on. But once you're in a production, it's a little bit different. The main thing is the rush. So you have to hurry up a little bit more. If I talk about the kind of artists that join pre-prods and the kind of artists that join production teams, so it's a lot easier to join a production team where there's the machine is already well oiled, the tasks are laid out, people know what they're doing, people know where they're going in a production. So it's a lot easier to plug and play artists, especially junior artists. So, you'll have already the pipeline well established, okay, you do this first and then you do that first and then you get it approved by that guy and then you can move on to this and to that and to this. And generally speaking, that's a lot of work that's been figured out already. So it's a good time to come in, and it's an easier time to come in. When you're working on a pre-prod, normally, the team, if it's a AAA studio, they're gonna get, they're gonna assemble kind of like their dream team, right? They want this to work, so they'll get a bunch of the artists that they think would do a good job, depending on what the project is, and then they'll bring those guys over, and then they'll tell them basically go, and then create something cool, and then it's a little bit riskier, from the perspective of the developer to hire kind of like newbies on pre-prods, because there's a lot at stake, and there's no pipeline established, so there's no the team is really small, so there's not that many mentors to help the new employees, the juniors. So most likely, working on a pre-prod is something that you do a little bit later in your career. At least that's the experience of most artists. And then working on a production, that's kind of where you would expect to come in as a junior. If you were to get a job. One thing that's important to know also about working in the industry is that it's very rare that you'll get a job at a AAA studio as your first job. So there are some artists that were for who it happened, but there are a few factors that help when that's the case. So a location is really big. So if you live right next to the studio you're applying to, even if you're if you're not that qualified compared to somebody else, just the fact that you're close and that they're not gonna have to spend any money on visa or any money to bring you over for the interview or anything like that is a huge bonus. So location is very, very important if you want to get in quicker. to those big studios location. And of course, you know, if you could, if you're going to a school that somehow has internships with those studios, and then you get your foot in the door as an intern first, then you're like, yeah, it's a huge bonus. But yeah, most of the time for most artists that work in those studios, you're gonna start off at another studio, another smaller studios, generally something a little bit less well known, or maybe something working on like mobile games, or working on for an indie developer. So yeah, don't expect to come in and work for your dream job right out of school, or right after posting your portfolio online. So that's probably not gonna happen. So, you know, being realistic, you're probably looking at working at you know, a smaller job first, and then kind of moving on to a bigger production. But I'm gonna pause the job talk right now and look at what we have so far. So here we go. We have our three characters. They're pretty much done. They're in a good spot. So I have kind of like a good feel, you know, for these characters. So they're very feminine, kind of like floaty a little bit, like pixie-like, and they all have their little different identities. So here we have like three different haircuts, three different faces. I mean, at this point the faces are, you know, similar. It's just a bunch of lines, but we'll see once we spend a little bit more time on them. And then we have three bodies that are fairly similar, because that's the whole point. The body's not supposed to change. And yeah, so next step, we're going to be coloring them.